great man passed away, I think on Motzei Shabbos. I don't know the exact time. It was Rabbi Bronspigel. Rabbi Abba Bronspigel was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Beis Medrash Talmud in Queens back in the year 2000. So that was 23 years ago. But that's not when he began his life's work. Rabbi Bronspigel actually started years ago in YU's high school and then continued in Yeshiva College. He was one of the great Magidei Shir there. And as it says in I remember the promotional materials announcing the formation of Beis Medrash Talmud as part of Lander College for Men in Queens. I was a student in MTA, graduated in 2000. So they announced that Rabbi Bronspigel had taken that position. I didn't know who he was at the time, even though I was in high school, because we didn't have much contact with the faculty there for the college age students. Yeah, there were some guys who went to so-called college shir. What was college shir? It means that in, I guess, junior or senior year, guys in MTA, that's the high school, could opt just to learn on a higher level. But of course, the so-called college shir that was available to guys in high school was basically just another high school shir. I think it was Rabbi Adler's shir, and I had quite a few friends who joined that shiur. You had to be part of a shiur, shir, as they say in English, in the mornings and early in the afternoon. So that starts basically at 8 o'clock in the morning, goes until 1 o'clock, and sometimes if you want to study more, it's until 2 o'clock, and when secular studies begin. So guys did that, and I heard that one of the bigger masbidim in the high school was actually a fan of Rav Schechter at the time, so his name came up. And Rabbi Bronspigel left YU, I think for ideological reasons. He felt that they went off the derech a little bit. Rabbi Bronspigel's own biography is a matter of public record. He gave a few public speeches about his early life. He was interviewed by people who want to document Holocaust testimony. And also he was asked on Holocaust Day back in Yeshiva to give a whole presentation. So that was recorded. That's found online. I highly recommend you listen to it. It was certainly eye-opening. The gist of it, I think Rav Bronspigel was born in 1937, on the eve of World War II, around, I think it was somewhere in like Mudgets, a place in Poland where everybody was basically already Hasidish, and he survived the Holocaust as a child, and so did some of his children. How? Because if you've ever seen Schindler's List, you'll see that, he wasn't a Schindler Yud, but Schindler basically kept his Jews alive, and there were other German businessmen in that area who also had their own pet Jews. It was worth it for them, economically speaking, to keep these Jews alive as slave labor. The difference was that Schindler, unlike his compatriots, he was originally in it for the profit, but eventually burned away all his profits, keeping his Jews alive. And he even started ripping off the Germans. Well, he sort of ripped off himself. He said he was going to evacuate all his Jews to his new armaments plant in what was then occupied Czechoslovakia. You've seen the movie. It's based on a true story. The book was called Schindler's Ark, but Schindler basically evacuated his Jews from Poland late in the war and said he was going to make shells for the Germans and bullets and things like that, but did not allow his factory to actually produce anything that actually worked because he didn't want to help the German war effort. So he was paying the Germans to have these Jews, and he was running a factory and feeding his workers, but he was basically burning away his money, and he ended up broke. But that's how he saved these people's lives. And he even asked, even though it was patently clear that he didn't need to save the women and the children, he did so anyways. So our Rosh Yeshiva was in that area. He wasn't a Schindler Yud, but he was among groups of Jews kept alive in those areas. That's why he's, I don't know, maybe a few of a dozen Jewish children who survived World War II within Poland. And that was quite a surprise. And then he came to America shortly after the war. I think he said he came at the age of 12 or so. After the war, the only education they had for Jewish children, the Chadarim, were gone. So they had people come from the Sochnut, and they were teaching them Hebrew and Zionism and things like that. So Rabbi Bronspigel surprised us by telling us that his second language actually was Hebrew. His first language was Yiddish, and he knew Polish, but I guess he didn't speak that much. And his second language was Hebrew. He only learned English as a teenager. And He came to study at YU, and he was really close to Rabbi Soloveitchik. Says that when Rabbi Soloveitchik started teaching in Yiddish, switched over to teach his main shiur in English. So Rabbi Bronspigel was the only one who continued conversing with him in English. He was like a holdover. He was the European-born student. Don't forget, because of his age, Rabbi Bronspigel didn't have other European-born friends at yeshiva college. All the other guys were American-born or something else, or Western Europe. But he was the only real Polisher who was there. So he was the old guard. And he taught at YU. I think he said he used to teach there for 40 years or so, whatever it was, 30 years before he jumped ship. And it was also strictly ideological. And Rabbi Parnas came with him. We'll stop there. And the yeshiva opened in 2000. I don't know exactly where they were before the campus opened in Kew Gardens Hills. This might have been before you guys were born even. And I first discovered him like consciously in 2001 when I started at CUNY, which is also in the neighborhood of Kew Gardens Hills. I came back to America. I found that in my parents' own backyard, there were two brand new yeshiva gedolas that they had just built. The first was Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim used to be in Forest Hills, RSA, Rabbinical Seminary of America. So now a whole network of yeshivas that their flagship was in Forest Hills. That's right in the middle of Queens, the older neighborhoods. And they moved out to Kew Gardens Hills. They built a new building. And I had seen that the construction site had been there for, I think, 2 years or so before I had left to Israel in 2000. And I came back in 2001, right before 9/11. They had just the grand opening of the new yeshiva building. And I was there the day they opened it. And that was kind of nice because it was really close to home and they had a very nice library. And I really found myself there. That's also, I met my partner Torah there. Partner Torah they wanted you to have a chavrusa over the phone. And I figured, they set me up with a fellow who was similar to my age, not of such a strong yeshiva background, and he lived in the neighborhood. I told him, I'm going to this new yeshiva's opening. Why don't you just come and meet me there? So we were considered poster boys for a partner Torah that supposed to have a phone chavrusa. Instead, we were actually just meeting in yeshiva. So that worked out pretty well. But I found myself at Lander, which was down the block. And across the street, there was another place they built. And I had friends who started attending there. I was, like I said, in CUNY, but I wanted to be in yeshiva. And I was there the first in Shabbos when Rabbi Bronspigel spoke. Yeah, he had a pulpit in Brooklyn, in Borough Park, but he would come for the first Shabbos of every Zman, and also on other occasions. So he was there during the weekdays and also certain Shabbos. So this first Shabbos he spoke, and I remember that it was actually refreshing to hear him speak. Why? Because in the olden days when rabbis would, let's say, talk Gemara, they'd use a lot of buys and ads and it's going on and all these other yeshivish phrases, and you don't know what they were talking about. It was complicated, and I don't know, just that's what I thought when I first started hearing high-level Talmudic shiurim. I couldn't understand anything that they were saying because they weren't speaking really in English, And he spoke, and I actually understood him and followed what he was saying. So that was kind of good. As a 19-year-old, that was pretty nice. And the next few years, I was basically staying in the base medrash, even though I wasn't enrolled in yeshiva for the next 3 years. I was attending his shiurim like one of the guys in yeshiva. And I thank the Menahel and the dean and the Rosh Yeshiva, of course, for allowing me to stick around because other guys came from college, from Queens College, and wanted to join, the base medrash and all that, and they didn't let them. I was the first and last one allowed into this status. And they tried to also poach me. Said, we'll offer you, other perks if you join the yeshiva, join Lander College and leave Queens College. So that was nice. And I basically was sitting always directly in front of the Rabbi Bronspigel, one row behind, or eventually just to his left. So that was my place in the shiur. And I stayed around even longer until I graduated high school and graduated college and stayed in the base medrash. So Rabbi Bronspigel was very inviting. The most important thing was, and it turns out it wasn't just my experience. It turns out that Rabbi Bronspigel, that's what he always did. He found people, and he found young men, and he brought them into yeshiva. He wanted them to stay. It was only later that I learned that his shiur in YU part of yeshiva college, you have to pick a shiur to be in the morning. His was the most popular YU at the time. He had the biggest classroom. His Reb Parnas, so YU losing them was a big deal. But there were reasons, like I said, ideologically, why he did leave. He felt that they were not staying true to the vision, that they had too much API courses in the curriculum at YU. And it might actually be true. They had quite a few people who were off the derech, teaching their secular subjects in the afternoons. And I understand why he left. It was good for us. And yeah, he made us all feel at home. He made us feel like a family. That was the most important thing. Even though I was, and this is a surprise, as far as people who were learning the Beis Medrash, everybody came from somewhere out of town or somewhere out of the neighborhood. I was the only one who actually lived, 1 block over and 3 blocks up. That's where my parents lived. That's where I grew up. They built the yeshiva in basically my backyard in an open lot that had previously been a swamp. I've been told as a kid that that's a swamp, and just there's a big open area like 4 blocks square that was not good for building anything because it was just too bad. And even the buildings across the street and a block over were basically sinking to mud. They always had foundation repair. You could see like these buildings were like tilting, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yeah. So of course they couldn't build anything there. And somehow Dr. Lander found engineers who could allow him to build in this area. I don't know how they did it, but I guess, some sort of method. No basements. The building had no basements, neither the dormitory. That's part of like the way they were able to make it work. And it wasn't such a tall building. No, it still isn't such a tall building. So that was very important for me that he brought me in. There was no reason why he should have done that. It wasn't rolled. I wasn't paying tuition, but he still brought me in there, and that was a good thing. And I kind of miss it. He had such a he loved encouraging the creation of new and ever-growing Jewish families. He used to chide people for going on shidduch dates. Parshas Vayera rolled around. Was Parshas Vayera about? Sorry, it's Parshas Chayesara. I said right here, Chayesara. What happens in Chayesara? Avram sends his Eved go find a match for his son. So he spoke about proper shidduchim. He made a joke about, he says Eliezer asked the prospective woman she would feed his camels some water, give drink to his camels. He said he used to close the shiur and say, here's a date, get in the car, drive up to the gas station, tell your date, ooh, I'm out of gas, would you gas the car for me? Okay, that's a good test. He himself, it turns out, was single at the time. He had been widowed. You could see this, he got remarried, but I don't think that marriage lasted because she wanted to live in Eretz Yisrael, and he didn't. So he was basically, for all intents and purposes, it turns out he was a widower at the time. And he remarried that spring, well, late winter, before Purim, the same day another Bacher in Yeshiva got married. And I was told that it was a very whirlwind thing. Like he met this widowed Rebbitzin, and they decided to get married. And so when he showed us this, he used to joke about getting married in shidduchim, and he actually lived it. And that was his greatest strength. They say David HaMelech. Yeah, they say David HaMelech. It's in 2 books of the Bible, and it's in Samuel and in the Chronicles. What does it say? David HaMelech was dancing before God. It says he brought the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem, and he was celebrating. And it says that he basically didn't care for his own thing. Criticized him for that. So Rabbi Bronspigel, when he danced in front of God, it wasn't a matter of him compromising his own dignity, but it was more of him compromising even his own health. So you'd see him jump up and down and dance and all these things in his late 60s and early 70s. And then it wasn't uncommon, or perhaps it happened every single time. What would happen? He'd basically faint. And my mother-in-law remembers this also at the dancing. You could see like we have wedding video, and also pictures where Bronspigel conducted the wedding. And then he was the most excited about the fact that one of the students actually got married. He took so much joy in that one of the students got married. And he wanted, of course, meet prospective brides. That was his other thing. Sit down in the office, he'll sign the forms and all that, but he has to know who you're marrying. I married within the yeshiva. I was a fellow in yeshiva. Actually, I went out with 2 girls from yeshiva. That is, one fellow wanted me to meet his sister, and it didn't work out. And so another fellow's sister. So I stayed within the yeshiva. So he was very happy about that. And Rabbi Bronspigel was, everybody could see it. He was jumping up and down just like one of the buckers. And I realize this now. One of the reasons why I felt that I should stick to teaching young men is because it keeps you young. He was so young at heart. Do you know that after all the dancing was done, we sat down to eat a little bit. He was so jovial that he walked over. People saw this. He started cutting the food on my plate for me. He's like, "Look, piece of chicken here. Let me cut your. Let me feed." He really tried to stuff it in my mouth. Okay, so I think he, like he said, his simcha, our simcha, was his personal simcha, and that's what he did. And like I said, he nearly fainted a few times when he would get all lebedik, and he was a real role model in that regard. Okay, he always put into practice, and of course he celebrated the birth of children because he believed in continuity, and I believe also as a child Holocaust survivor, it really meant something to him. Yeah, what else did he do? He always told us to be intellectually honest. That's something he insisted on. Intellectually honest. When you study this, if you give pshat to say it, he never told anybody, oh, that's a bad pshat in what you're saying. How dare you ask this question? He even one time asked me when we were learning Shabbos, which is the Masechta we finished right before my wedding. So that would be in mid 2005. He actually asked me to obtain a copy of an art scroll for him. There's nothing wrong with art scroll. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a big fan of art scroll. It's behind me. I prefer if I look at anything Steinsaltz for whatever reason. But he thus taught us that there's nothing wrong. Even the Rosh Hashiva occasionally says, Avi, go get me an art scroll. I want to look up something. Okay. So that's what he sent me to do. There was no art scroll in the base matters. So I had to, of course, look in our own private collections, find something in the library. So bring it to him. He used to also then go to the library almost on a daily basis and read the newspaper. That way he could stay aware of everything that was going on. He didn't want to be out of it. He joked politically. I've said this before. He said it's very important that guys go and vote. Now, I was the only local resident around there, so I don't think everybody picked up on yeshiva on whatever day it was, the election day, and went back home to vote. Some guys, it was hard, so they just didn't vote. I voted every single time. And his joke was, so the New York Times has endorsements. He would read the New York Times and said, look, you go up to the editorial page, New York Times endorsements, every single election in the area, who to vote for. So take this with you when you go to the polls, and vote against everybody that the New York Times endorses. That is what Rabbi Bronspigel told us to do. He said it with of course, tongue in cheek, but he felt that politically speaking, says he certainly wasn't a leftist, wasn't such a proud Democrat, and he also wasn't as Zionist as his friends were. Remember, Rabbi Soloveitchik was the head of the Mizrahi and spoke on Yom Ha'atzmaut. That was his main shir every year. And Rav Schechter and others really picked up that Zionism, and Rabbi Bronspigel didn't. He says, I'm not such a Zionist, a religious Zionist like they say. That wasn't his thing. Doesn't mean that his students didn't study in Eretz Yisrael. Doesn't mean that they didn't make Aliyah. He told me you don't have to. I remember him sitting there. He says, you don't have to go there. That was his own view. He had his children there. He eventually moved to Muncie, by the way. But he certainly wasn't against it. He says he prays for Eretz Yisrael and Medinas Yisrael all the time. Well, that's what he was, of course, as any other Jewish person supporting the growth of the state. He had saw nothing wrong with it. I remember around the times the times leading up to the Hitnatkut, the disengagement from Gaza, which also, if you guys are 18, so that would be around the time we were, just around the time we were born. So yeah, it's almost a nothing in your eyes, but the Hitnatkut was a major turning point in that theologically. I've already forgotten what people were saying about it. I remember when Rabbi Stav told us about it, but I remember Rav Schechter said something about it, and I asked Rabbi Bronspigel at the Kumsitz that started the opening shir that year, that Shabbos, and he spoke up. Of course, everybody was asking. It was a very important. I remember it was done in the classroom where he used to give shir. It was expanded classroom. They pulled down the divider. Usually it'd be divided up the shir room, so it'd be half size. They opened it up so we could have a big kumsitz that night, and the mashkiach was sitting next to him. And I asked him if he was aware of what Rav Schechter said. It turns out Rav Schechter was his close friend from yeshiva. He says, I don't know it. I don't care. He was very strict about that. He's not that lockstep Zionist statist as everybody else. His favorite song was Lule Sorascha of Karli Bach. Lule Sorascha Shashu. You remember? You know that song? It's a classic. It's one of Karl Bach's first album, and he used to love that tune. So I was a Bal Tefillah. I used to have a better voice. So I used to work that into somewhere in the davening when he was there for Shabbos, and he would also go along with it. I remember I davened Musaf that first Shabbos, and I don't know, for Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hu Elokeinu, Lu Leiso Rascha. Oh man, he really liked that song. I remember he'd saying at his house, he says, I have a CD that has this, and it showed up in the house. I listened to that song. Where'd it come from? His wife's like, I bought it for you. You told me you liked that song, so that it was the original recording. So it's you can get that. It's Karl Bach's, I think, Hanasham Alach was his first album. One of the first albums has a recording of that. Okay.
Yeah, so.
And the better Mimkomcha. Everybody knows Mimkomcha Malkeinu. So Karl Bach sang Mimkomcha, which you have to go through a few octaves to sing properly. So if you can't hit the high notes, you can't sing it. You have to start low and you have to end up high. Okay, look on a piano that goes through. Most people can't sing that song. So that's the CD. So Rabbi Bronspigel really liked that tune, and it was his favorite. He was a miracle child, basically, in the fact that he survived that long. What else we have here? So it was this intellectual honesty that made him want to leave yeshiva, and also he would respectfully criticize his former colleagues at YU. There was an incident where the bunch of Galachim, the big shots in the Catholic Church, the cardinals came to visit YU, not just once. And Rabbi Bronspigel spoke out against it and wrote a letter to the YU's newspaper about this. He was highly critical. There was a fellow, not Ratzinger. Ratzinger became the Pope. He was the current retired Pope. Maybe just passed away recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope after John Paul II, and I think he took the name Benedict II. Benedictus. Okay. Okay. Whatever it is, he wasn't original. Now we have Pope Francis. Okay. So Rabbi Bronspigel didn't like that. There was a fellow. Oh, his name is something with a ger, Lustiger or Lustiger in French, and his complaint about this Lustiger, this French cardinal, was that he was born Jewish and he's a Meshumid. So maybe you could say that whatever he's a mamish tinok shenishba. And Rabbi Bronspigel didn't feel that way. The guy said no, he's a Meshumid, and he felt that the Catholic Church is full of bloodshed, and he was very open about this. Because it's why you should have told the Catholic Church, like, thank God we don't live in Catholic countries and we're not subjugated to you anymore. Please go away. And so he's still critical of them, and so I admire his intellectual honesty in that respect. Because let's say I've spoken to Rabbi Abramovich about this, of blessed memory, and Rabbi Riskin's opinions are well known, and other rabbis who certainly have more mild approaches to the church. Someone asked about this. What do you think of the chief rabbis, the current chief rabbi in England and the previous chief rabbi? I very much respect them. They're entitled to their opinion. I think they're in terrible situations where they have to go along with not even Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. They have to pay lip service. They have to show respect. Sometimes they have to attend certain church functions. The previous chief rabbi was close to the current king. So that's a difficult situation that, thank God, I am not in their situations, but I honestly think it's still wrong, despite the fact that great rabbis look the other way. My Rebbe felt that it's all avodah zarah. Like you saw, the Rambam says, all Christianity is avodah zarah. So Rabbi Bronspigel did not like that. He wouldn't have had the cardinals come and visit in his own base medrash, even if they're not coming to try to influence us in any way. They were just trying to learn from the Jews how they conduct things in the base medrash. They were Ramish coming to look and learn, but still, Rabbi Bronspigel felt that was inappropriate. I understand Rabbi Bronspigel himself, a survivor of the Holocaust from Europe, so he had a different opinion than, let's say, American-raised Rabbanim like Rav Willig and Rav Schechter. So that's what made him different. That's why he was so opposed to this. Rabbi Bronspigel loved studying the Minchas Chinuch. And everybody got a copy. Have you studied Minchas Chinuch? It's good. I wish they had a copy here, but I incorporated some Minchas Chinuch into whatever it is we look at, because he has good diukim. It was very enjoyable. He used to humorously criticize or critique modern day Chumrah culture. He didn't believe in modern day Chumer culture. He joked before Passover that he has sons and sons-in-law who are much more machmir than he is, especially the eating the matzah and the maror. The old school rabbis. Kazayas means, you eat a bite full of matzah, a bite full of maror. And he didn't accept the whole, well, it must be olives were much bigger back in the olden days. So to discharge one's obligation on Passover, one has to eat large, copious amounts and quickly of these foodstuffs. He didn't believe that. And he said other things. Yeah, everybody's much more from. He's not so, he would say, I'm not so from. Okay. And Rabbi Bronspigel continued, like I said, he was the one who was studying in Yiddish, but when it came down to speaking Hebrew, it turns out he could give shir in Hebrew just like anybody else. He said it was his second language before English. So he spoke English just fine. You could tell he had an accent and certain mannerisms, certain ways he spoke. But it turns out his when it came down to Hebrew, he was fluent. And that was actually something we're going to get to. So when it came time for him to speak Hebrew or address people in Hebrew, he didn't have that inescapable American sound like all the other rabbis have, like what we have. And by the way, I don't really care to try to develop an Israeli accent, but he didn't sound like, whatever it is that we sound like. He could pass. And we even had a Israeli Rosh Yeshiva who came from Keren B'Yavne. Rabbi Stav, I mentioned him before. He came on sabbatical and taught at Yeshiva for a while. So I remember it was him, the two of them sitting at Shabbos at the table. They were talking for hours and learning. It was entirely in Hebrew. And also Rabbi Bronspigel would help. There's Israelis who made Yerida, and they came to him to sell their chametz and other things and take care of their other rabbinical needs. So that was what he did. So this problem was that he didn't get to teach a lot of Diktuk and Tanakh because the shir had to be about Gemara. We didn't have shirim in Tanakh or anything else. Okay, so we had, for those who want to study Ordei, so we're halacha shirim. Mostly it's also centered around Talmud and codes, but there was nothing really on the yeshiva curriculum that was beyond Talmud. And the mashgiach gave Musar shmuz. So he also had, Musar classics. He was learning things like Nefesh Chaim and, Orchos study, given the rest of it. But we never really learned that. So here's where it comes up, interestingly. This is relevant to that tshuva that someone said in Rabbi Fran's shura that someone cross-posted before. There was a time when I was a bacher that I was singing my Zmiris on Shabbos because I don't know if I had perfect pitch, but I could find a good key and hold it, and I could be loud. So that was something I used to do. And I, of course, worked in a little bit of a thuf and a wow and all that. And there was one fellow there who was actually well known, rightfully so, for his hasmada and commitment to halacha, and told me that, no, that's usher. Try to sound like everybody else. And did I ask you Rosh Yeshiva? How could I do such a thing? So right after Shabbos, I went to speak to Rabbi Bronspigel in his office. His office used to be right along 150th Street, near the entrance to the yeshiva, 150th Street in Queens. And he said, no, I told him I started learning about these things. I'm very interested in it. And someone says it's usher, you can't actually put anything into practice, even when you're singing Zmiris. And Rabbi Bronspigel said, characteristically, Adarabba. That was his thing. He used to say Adarabba. It's a mitzvah. We need people who study these things just like all the other neglected areas of Torah study. We need boys like you to study geography and the sciences and Lashon HaKodesh, because in yeshiva, we dedicate official time to studying Gemara. Okay. He said about Rabbi Soloveitchik, why didn't he like that Rabbi Soloveitchik start teaching in English? He says, his Yiddish was Mama Lashon. He spoke it well, but he also spoke it naturally. But his English was a Germanic academic English, like a professor. He says he didn't speak normal. That's where the Rav didn't speak English normal, not normally, normal. I'll give you an example. I tell you, he held his glasses, says, I tell you to turn off the lights. Rabbi Soloveitchik would say, extinguish the illuminators. Okay. So, and indeed, that's how he spoke. So that's why it wasn't his thing. And he said about reading works like Halachic Man. Have you read Halachic Man? He says he studied Rabbi Soloveitchik's Lumdis, but he didn't read the philosophical works that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, Halachic Man and The Lonely Man of Faith. He says, Rav Lichtenstein, the Rav's son-in-law, he's a genius. but even he needed a dictionary to get through that book. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm not a genius. So he held Rav Lichtenstein also in very, very high esteem. Okay, because Rav Lichtenstein was the one who was closest to Rabbi Soloveitchik. And so he continued. He told me, he then asked me, "Do you know what a patach genuva is? You know, grammar. You know what a patach genuva is?" That's what he asked me. Of course, you have to study these things. What's a patach? Patach genuva is that very simple thing that you learn in first grade. You don't think about it. They don't tell you what it's called. When you have a word like Noach, they put the patach under the chet, but you're supposed to read it before the chet. Noach. Why? I could say no, I can say note, and I could say no, but I can't say no and then a chet. I have to say noach. And same thing with an ayin or mapik. That's a patach genuva. And he says, or nasogachor. What's nasogachor? Nasogachor is vayomer lo, okay, or vayomiru lo, bara li, instead of bara. Nasogachor is when you accent the second word, then the first word preceding it, often the accent goes from being on the last syllable to a previous syllable. Okay, that's nasogachor. I love studying these things, and they don't study them anymore. Rabbi Bronspigel even gave me a bracha. You should study these things. So his attitude was, you have to know Hebrew. And by the way, so this answers the question, Rav Kook. Of course you should stick to Havar Ashkenazis for things that we do bedavka, if you know it. If you say, well, Ashkenazis means it's parai, mil el. No, it's not. We have a positive tradition that the accent is on the last syllable. We have a positive tradition that the cholim vowel should not sound like a kametz yud. It doesn't mean you have to stick to those things. We have a positive tradition. They asked, I think it was Rav Chaim or whatever, question about an esrog. How do you know that one of the grafted esrogim, of which there were many back in the 1800s, why are they grafting esrogim? Because it makes them hardier. They could grow more of them, and they could then, export them around the world. Mm-hmm. They used to grow esrogim in the Caribbean, in Sicily, and other places like that, and try to bring them. That's how the esrog market started back then. How do you know a grafted esrog is not kosher? So the simple answer is not esrog. It's half an esrog. Okay, it has to be an esrog. So too, you don't have to say like, if a positive tradition to pronounce a tough like a samich. You know that a tough is not a samich. This is a samich, and it's an old tradition that samich and sin sound very similar. So much so that in certain books of the Bible and the Talmudim, they're already interchangeable. It's even machlokas what it should be in some cases, samich or sin. So that's something even in Second Temple times you can't go back to. But it's perfectly clear that a tough is not supposed to sound like a samich. So you can't say, well, it's Ashkenazis. You have to find out the difference. We have written traditions of how things should sound, explaining how they should sound. So yeah, be the best Ashkenazic medactic you can be, but know what is part of the tradition. And that's what I learned from that. It's because of this, I included this anecdote in the end of the book. So it's very unfortunate. Rabbi Bronspigel hasn't been with us already. He passed away this week, but he was quite ill. He was unresponsive and not communicative in his final years. So it's been, like Rabbi Victor Miller says, it's been, I guess, it sort of eases the transition. We went to see him 3 years ago. 3 years ago this month. It was very hard to get in touch with him. He was already in Lakewood, basically in convalescence. And he wasn't so responsive then. He was being attended to by 2 orderlies at his home. And I brought him to meet, I brought the family to him. He'd only seen my daughter. Now, thank God, more kids. Also to bring a copy of the Haggadah. So I was talking. I don't think my wife noticed that he wasn't really, like I said, responsive. But the most amazing thing happened because then I showed him my son. Because, my son was only born 10 years to the day after I met my wife. It took a while. So I said, by the way, this is my son and all that. And suddenly he perked up. He grabbed my hand hard. He sort of woke up. He grabbed me really hard and he sat up and he looked very serious. So I could see in his eyes that he was awake. Because I told him, here's my son. And that was amazing. He wanted to hold hands, And I feel sorry that we had to go. And I feel sorry that he had to go. Yeah. It's good to have that connection. I always felt that you could only learn Torah from someone who's much older than you. Drink the wine. So when we were growing up, Rabbi Bronspigel was old. He was basically my grandfather's generation. My grandfather was an older Holocaust survivor. My grandfather was basically an adult Holocaust survivor. Rabbi Bronspigel was a child Holocaust survivor. I remember him speaking to my grandfather. I don't know what they were saying. I didn't get to hear what they said, but they spoke a little bit. They met. And to me, it was a real connection to the past. There was no, by the time, YU used to have Holocaust survivors and old school faculty, as did all the other yeshivas. They used to have only Europeans were teaching in the yeshivas. By the time I was in high school in the late 90s, there were no old European Rabbanim teaching at YU. Rabbi Bronspigel was the only one, but only because he was a child survivor. His Rebbeim were gone. So for us, that was a real connection to the past. So Yizachro Baruch, he raised up a lot of Talmidim. Rabbi Bronspigel didn't have that many written works. He had Bikur Abba and some other articles. Bikur Abba was his book of Chidushim on Maseches, on Seder Zerayim, and some other things. If you go read it, I have a copy at home. It was put out by some of his last Talmidim at YU, the last generation, the late 90s Talmidim. And thank God we got to hear a lot from him. And yeah, I think it's only to our misfortune that he's no longer with us. It's a real end of an era. He was basically the last one. So sorry I had to take all your time about this, but it's worth divrei hesped. Rabbi Bronspigel did a lot for us.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.